Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Robert Eringer, Eringer, and he came to my attention. He's done some work on this topic that's really burning up the internet about the Epstein files. If you're watching this on my three YouTube channels, X, Rumble, you'll see his Substack. It's just his last name. I'll put a link to his Substack. He writes on a variety of different topics. But our intro topic is going to be the Zorro Ranch, which I think is coming into people's idea. They always think of maybe Epstein as the island, Florida, Palm Beach, or Manhattan, but sometimes Zorro gets overlooked. But this is an important aspect of this whole criminal enterprise. But Robert's written many books. He spent nearly 5 decades in the intelligence and investigative game. He began as an undercover journalist for Fleet Street and served as a foreign correspondent for the Toronto Star and the Toledo Blade. He infiltrated the Ku Klux Klan. In 1993, operated undercover for FBI counterintelligence in Moscow, Havana, and beyond. In 2002, Prince Albert of Monaco appointed him to intelligence advisor, and he went on to create the Principality's first intelligence service. He lives in Montecito, and where his truth questing continues over fine Pinot Noir. Nice little wine country up there. I've been to Monaco. It's a beautiful place as well. It kind of reminds me of Montecito, actually. It's interesting. I spent a lot of time in Santa Barbara myself. But it's interesting that you're here today because I had Eric O'Neill on, who was a long-term FBI agent. So kind of keeping with that trend of having a lot of FBI people here. But for people who don't know you, Robert, maybe you can talk a little bit more about your bio. What led up to your most recent, I know you're publishing a book in about a month or so. I'll try to bring the title up. But maybe you can just talk about your background, what led you to your interest in covering the Zorro Ranch.
Sure. Thank you for having me, William. Pleasure to be here with you. My background is what I call the information business. I've been involved in investigative journalism, book publishing, and intelligence, which to my thinking is all pretty much the same thing. It's about the acquisition, analysis, and dissemination of information. The only difference is in journalism, you're looking for the widest possible audience. And in intelligence, it's usually just a very tiny select audience of readers. I started off on Fleet Street in London, where I infiltrated the Ku Klux Klan. They were trying to establish what they call a clavern in Britain, and I managed to infiltrate it early on to a point where the Imperial Wizard of South Carolina, Robert E. Scoggin, invited me to travel to Spartanburg, South Carolina. In fact, he insisted on it so that I could be officially naturalized was the word they use. They meant initiated into the KKK. So I and two reporters from the Sunday People newspaper traveled to Spartanburg, South Carolina, spent a week there, and we were initiated into the KKK. In fact, after the initiation, which was done by the Imperial Wizard himself, off came the robes and hoods of all the assembled Klans people around us, and out came a tape measure. Why a tape measure? Because they measured us up for bespoke robes. And these weren't just the normal white robes. They tailor-made us red satin robes. The reason is they made us Kleagles, which is Klan speak for officer. And they did that because it was presumed we would return to Britain and lead the Klan there. In fact, of course, what happened was we got back to Britain, and over 2 successive Sundays, front page and center spread splash, they call it, or used to on Fleet Street, exposed everybody involved. They scattered like rats, and that was the end of the KKK in Britain. Anyway, that kind of work, undercover work, I then went on to do as a specialty, infiltrating extremist groups and exposing them in newspapers such as the News of the World and the Sunday Mirror, and again, the Sunday People. And eventually, was able to put those skills to work for FBI counterintelligence. I must point out that I was never fully employed by the FBI. I was never a special agent, nor have I ever purported to be. I was a subcontractor, and it was based on doing the kinds of ruses for the Bureau that I had been doing in journalism. The difference, of course, is now instead of a wide audience, it was a select, very small audience, maybe of 3 or 4 persons within the Bureau, because my identity was strictly guarded. And I wrote about that particular period of my life in a book called Ruse, Undercover with FBI Counterintelligence. That was published in 2008 by Potomac Books. And I talk about the missions that I did for the Bureau, starting with the attempt to rendition Edward Lee Howard, who was the only former CIA guy to ever successfully defect to Moscow. He did that in 1985, which was known as the Year of the Spy, and he was living there in the early 1990s, actually from 1985 onward. In 1993, an interesting opportunity arose whereby Howard wanted to write a book. He did, in fact, write that book. It was called Safe House. And I became his editor, except what he didn't know was that I was really working undercover secretly for the FBI. And the idea was to get to know him, befriend him, and try to figure out a way to lure him back to the United States to face the music. That went on for a bit. It went on for a few years. In fact, we could have renditioned Edward Lee Howard. Everything was in place to do that. And the Bureau was very gung-ho in association with the CIA. However, at the 11th hour, when we knew where Howard would be, where we could nail him, the Clinton White House intervened and aborted the mission. So the FBI was not allowed to get its man, and Edward Lee Howard continued to operate freely, at least inside Russia, and he would travel throughout Europe as well, until he met in untimely death in 2000, I believe it was 2002, July 2002, when at the age of, I believe he was 50 or 51, he supposedly fell down a flight of stairs at his dacha, and broke his neck. And the problem with what the Russians said about that is his dacha didn't have a basement. But I've never much trusted the old KGB, still don't. Anyway, my work for the Bureau went on and on and on, not only doing Edward Lee Howard, but rusing the former chairman of the KGB, Vladimir Krychkov, and getting to know Howard's Cuban contacts, which led me to the Cuban mission and those doing espionage among the Cubans in Washington, D.C. Made for a couple of interesting chapters in that book. And eventually, I crossed the line from counterintelligence to criminal investigations to try to hasten the extradition of Ira Einhorn from France. He'd been a wanted fugitive for a few decades for murdering his girlfriend in Philadelphia in the late 1970s.
Keep her in the closet too, right? Put her in a thing.
That's right. He mummified her. In fact, when the FBI finally raided his apartment in Philadelphia, and they broke down the closet that was locked, and they found the mummified remains, they also found a library book at how to mummify a human being.
Wow, I didn't know that.
As you could imagine, that was evidence against him, partly, except he absconded and ended up on the run for a number of years until he was discovered in France. It was my job to get to know him again as purporting to be a book editor. I convinced Ira that he was going to be a best-selling author and that I would ensure that his books got published. And then he began to, from there, finally.
Sorry to interrupt, but wasn't he assisted by one of the Brofman heirs or something. One of the
Yes.
women. Yeah.
Initially, yeah.
Because that was the
Okay.
precursor to the Nexium. Was like the same woman was involved. Are you familiar with that?
That's right. He was very popular for whatever reason, rather charismatic. I didn't get that myself, but when I met him at his farmhouse in France, but I guess he'd aged a bit. And
What year is that? What year around is that?
we're talking about the late 1990s, 98, 97, 98, 99. It went on for a bit. The French were were stringing us along in terms of when the Philadelphia investigator who'd been hunting Einhorn for years finally discovered his whereabouts. The French arrested him, but then they let him go a few days later, and extradition proceedings got launched. But the French kept dragging their feet, dragging their feet. They would tell the United States, the DOJ, well, we can't extradite him because we don't believe in the death penalty, and you have that in Pennsylvania where he would be tried. And they turn around and say, "Well, we've already passed a special law just for that, to say that we will give Ira Einhorn a new trial." They did try him. They had tried him in absentia, and he'd been sentenced, I think, to death. And they said, "We will." It was actually a law. The legislature passed it. We will give Ira Einhorn a new trial. So please, please hand him over. So then the French said, "Well, uh, we don't believe in trials in absentia." They just kept dragging and dragging and dragging, and finally, I would think that my intervention is what caused the French to finally capitulate and hand him back. If you want to hear that story really quickly, it's because,
Sure.
um, yeah, what happened was Einhorn knew that sooner or later he was probably going to get extradited to the United States. And I went over as his book editor and suggested that he go to Poland, that we create a whole new life for him in Krakow. That is me, the publisher, not the FBI, even though they were supporting the whole thing, but of course they know what I'm doing. We will, a person like you belongs in a wonderful city like Krakow in southern Poland because it's very artsy, and it'll be good publicity for your book to have absconded again. So he liked that idea. He loved being stroked. He had a very huge ego, Einhorn. But he said he had a better idea, that his lawyers and others around him had been prompting him to go to Cuba. And Cuba was where still to this day, American criminals roam free, if you could call Havana and Cuba free. Joanne Chesimard, the Black Panther lady who killed a New Jersey state trooper, was living in Havana at the time. She's since passed away. And it was explained to Einhorn that that would probably be his best bet. Well, he had the misfortune of telling me this at a time when John Ashcroft, who was the Attorney General, was just about to have a meeting with Holly Maddox's siblings. Holly Maddox was the beautiful young lady who Einhorn bludgeoned to death and then mummified in his home. So when I got back from my trip to see Einhorn, and I was working with the FBI agents from the FBI fugitive squad in Philadelphia. And when I explained what Einhorn was going to do, John Ashcroft was apparently livid and got on the phone to the French counterparts over there and said, if he gets away and ends up in Cuba, there's going to be hell to pay. We understand from our own sources that's what he has in mind, and you better not let it happen. Lo and behold, 1 week later, way many months ahead of what was supposed to be the next um, hearing, although it was supposed to be a minor one, about his extradition. 1 week later, all of a sudden, the court in Bordeaux, France, said, you're expected in court in a week, and we're going to decide extradition. He was blown away, couldn't believe it. And showed up in court, and they they judged that he would be extradited. So he sort of did what he told me he was going to do. What he told me he was going to do, he'd never go back to the United States, that he would prefer to kill himself, and that what he was going to do is immolate himself in flames like the Vietnamese monks did to protest rulers of Vietnam back in the early 60s. And he did go through the motions. He invited French media crews into the kitchen of his farmhouse and took out a butter knife and punctured his neck. But of course, an ambulance was called. He was bandaged up. It really wasn't a serious injury. They gave him a few days to recuperate, and then the gendarmes arrived to put him in their vehicle, drive him to Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, and hand him over to my two buddies in the fugitive squad, where he was put in handcuffs, put on a plane, and flown back to the United States, where true to their word, they provided him a new trial. It took the jurors only 4 hours to convict him of murder, and he spent the rest of his life at Hootsdale State Penitentiary, from which he wrote me a letter 6 months after he was in prison and saying, "What happened to you? Where are you? You were supposed to publish my book."
So he never got onto the ruse as you
Never did. Nope.
titled your book. Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, good
Sorry
for
about
him.
that
You
long
wanted
story
to-
about the FBI. I
No,
know we want to talk about Monaco and
I
other
do. I
things.
want to talk about Grace Kelly, Grace Kelly's son, the Order of the
Okay.
Solar Temple. Are you familiar with that?
Say again?
The Order of the Solar Temple, because that's where Grace
Yeah.
Kelly, when she supposedly drove off the cliff, she ended up on property of this cult called the Order of the Solar Temple. Have you heard of that?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm aware of her affiliation with that group, and I
Yeah.
believe that's probably true. Whether it had a connection to her death or not, I'd be less sure of. Although I do think there is some question about whether the Italian mafia was involved in her sad, tragic demise. Believe it or not, I think she was only 52 at the time, but there was something very mysteriously wrong with her brakes, and she chose the wrong roads to go down. I know that trio of curves that exist coming down from La Turbie into Monaco, treacherous, but with brakes not working, fatal in her case. Certainly, there was a mafia connection in the death of Stefano Casaraghi, who was Princess Caroline's husband, who died in the tragic yacht racing accident. I believe that was in 1990, where his boat flipped mysteriously, and he was killed. And then, after he was buried at Monaco's cathedral, there are persons who tried to steal his corpse. And that has been associated with the Italian mafia, partly because of promises that had been made about their ability to penetrate Monaco's very lucrative real estate market, and they went undelivered. There's huge fights that go on all the way up until today over real estate in Monaco. Monaco's probably cost more per square foot than anywhere else in the world.
Wow.
And building has always been the big money spinner there, and most of the corruption relates to that business. Sorry, once again, I've gone off on a tangent here.
No, it's
Please,
not. It's very
back to you.
important, actually. People don't understand the attraction, the allure of Monaco. It's a small principality. It's run by a family, hereditary monarchy, right? But low taxes or a tax haven, right?
Well, it is a tax haven for most people, not Americans, because if you are an American citizen, you are obliged to file income tax returns wherever in the world you live. So Americans don't find it a tax haven. But if you're British, Swedish, any other number of European nationalities, if you live or claim to live full-time in Monaco, you do not have to pay tax to your country of birth or where even you spend some time.
Wow. So how did you come by, like, as an American, getting into becoming an Intel asset for the family there?
Like most of my life, serendipitously, I was involved in book publishing in the late 1980s, and the opportunity arose to move to Monaco. And I thought, well, being much younger than I am now, of course, the sense of adventure overtook me, and I uprooted to Monaco for a couple of years. rationalizing that I would scout literary talent since at that time I was representing authors with books. Um, I handled William Colby's book about Vietnam, Lost Victory, and Robert Kupperman's book, Final Warning, about terrorism. And I wanted to do the same thing. The bad news is I never really discovered any literary talent in Monaco, but I did make friends with Prince Albert. Got to know him, others. It's a very small community generally. I mean, the country itself is only a mile and a half square. It's comprised, was then, of about 35 different nationalities. The Monegasques are outnumbered in their own country. But
And
among
that's
the
Grace Kelly's son, right? For people.
yeah, Prince Albert is Grace Kelly's son and the son of Prince Rainier, who at that time was the monarch in Monaco and led with an iron fist. Um, got to know Albert, and then I disappeared from Monaco, went to Washington, D.C., connected with Claire George. He didn't want to write a book, so instead he and I went into the private sector intelligence business, almost as a joke. Um, we sat outside the Chevy Chase Club, and when he told me he wasn't going to write a book after all, he said, "Well, maybe we can do something else together." And I said, "Well, like solve people's problems." And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "But only billionaires and royalty." And he said, "That sounds good." And lo and behold, within a couple of months, we had a billionaire and a member of a royal family, not Albert in Monaco, but a titled aristocrat as clients. And we did very well with that. And then, as I mentioned, I got involved with counterintelligence work for the FBI and did that through the 1990s. When my work for the Bureau ended around 2001, I saw Albert and we talked about his concern of the Russian surge into the South of France, the French Riviera. The Russians through the 90s have been predominantly laundering money in Switzerland. That was their out of home base. But the Swiss had enough and told them to move on, and they did. And they were beginning to move into the south of France. Albert had concerns about that. He also had concerns about various people from all kinds of nationalities because Monaco's a melting pot and the crossroads of everybody everywhere around the globe, especially wealthy people. And he had concerns about some of the people who were trying to enter his social orbit, as everybody tries to do in Monaco. In fact, the ongoing contest is who can brown their nose the deepest. Um, so he thought it would be a good idea to retain me as his intelligence advisor, specifically to look into the Russian influence in Monaco, but also to check out various persons who were trying to enter his social orbit. And and retained me in June of 2002 to do that. The first thing I did was I realized that on my own and with some contacts I had that I brought into the situation with me, we would not be able to provide Albert with the kind of intelligence we really needed to unless we had some assistance that didn't cost us any money. So I embarked on creating liaison relationships with other intelligence services, primarily at first the CIA and Britain's MI6. And my pitch was very simply that pretty soon Prince Albert of Monaco, once his father passed, would be the monarch, and he wanted to do something about the corruption in Monaco and about money laundering. So they very kindly signed on. We created liaison relationships, and whenever I needed to know about any topic or individual, all I had to do was provide them the names, and they would run traces, and they would provide what I needed to give to Albert so that he could be better informed. On top of which, uh, CIA MI6 offered to come brief him on any given subject. Once we had David Steele of the famous Steele dossier. At that time, he was apparently running Russia House, the Russian division inside MI6, and he personally came to Monaco to brief Albert and me on Putin and Russia. He was very polished, very professional. It was a great briefing. Sorry that he ventured off in the private sector and went a wrong direction. that was later explained to me how that can happen. We can get back to it, but I don't want it to interfere with what we're talking about here. I organized liaison relationships when Prince Rainier passed in April 2005 and Albert ascended the throne. My role changed. Excuse me. Let me have a little bit of water here.
Yeah. I mean, it is interesting. I mean, what I know that the Russians kind of came into south of France pretty strong before 2014, before the conflict started.
Yep.
But like, what was the kind of, how would they launder their money? How would they launder their assets from the Putin era? I guess it would be the post collapse.
Just normal confidential banking in Monaco. Banking at that time, anybody could come in and launder money. It's not as easy now, but it's easier in Monaco than in most places because a lot of people have had to reform, or the international financial community will put them on a gray list or a black list, and they won't be able to communicate with the rest of the world. But back then, in the early aughts, anybody could open, well, you'd have to have a bunch of money, but if you were a Russian coming in, the banks were glad to have you. You show up with $10 million, even in cash, in suitcases, and you have an account. And that may still happen today, although less likely. I'm sure they've gotten far more sophisticated about that. But that's the answer, confidential banking. I was saying earlier that after Prince Albert ascended the throne, I created the Monaco Intelligence Service. I no longer had to be just intelligence advisor. I created a service because that's what it was at that point, and it needed to be, because we then embarked on creating a whole new slew of relationships with foreign intelligence services all around Europe. And it was very productive for us because, once again, we could get whatever information we needed quick on just about anything and everything. And I went on to then begin to assemble the various financial intelligence units of the micro-European states like Luxembourg, Malta, San Marino, which is surrounded by Italy, and Liechtenstein, and discovered that before my arrival on the scene to try to organize them, there was absolutely no meaningful contact between the financial intelligence units. Luxembourg actually had and still has a proper intelligence service, but the smaller states, they never got beyond financial intelligence units within their police departments. Well, I created an association of micro-European intelligence services, and we began to have meetings, and we created a common shield among us so that we could keep each other informed about what Russians or other nationalities were hopping from one tax haven microstate to another, looking for banks to launder their money in.
Right. So is this kind of the heraldry right here, the Monaco Intelligence Service?
That's yes. Yeah. In fact, I was working with Prince at one point, starting around 2006. I brought into our service Prince Albert's cousin, a man by the name of Jean-Leonard de Massy. And he was the guy who then kind of helped us officialize and struck these badges and so on, just so we could go to foreign intelligence agencies and say, see, we really exist. We're real. A lot of them needed more than that. In fact, almost every intelligence service that had a relationship with us first would come to Monaco, and they would meet Prince Albert in person at the safe house that I kept in Monaco. And only then were they satisfied that this was real and that we were off and running with an information
the population
intelligence
of Monaco,
exchange.
Yeah, it's not very big. I think it's under 20,000 of permanent.
Yeah, when I was there, it was more like 30 plus. Now it's higher because they've created a lot more space in the last 15 years. A lot more buildings have gone up, and it's closer to 40,000 now.
40,000 like permanent residents, like people who are like non.
Well, they call the foreign residents call themselves permanent residents, and that's how they're able to renew their residency permits every few years. But most of them just use it as an official residence, and then they do things like run up their electricity bills by keeping the lights on, so they can, when they're called in for an interview, they can try to prove that they're actually living there full time.
And this is the cover of your upcoming book here, Spy Master of Monte Carlo. That's come in. That's Valerie Plame, Bob Baer, which is a strange thing. I've had another guest on here who went to school with Valerie Plame, and he wrote a book called Ruse. So it's kind of a weird synchronicity.
Uh,
But
yeah, yeah. He's a good guy. I like Bob.
yeah, so you've had some there. There's some of these famed names, Bill Cooper and all that other stuff. So, how long was your stint in Monte Carlo?
5.5 years. It went on until about the end of 2007, at which point it became clear to me, or it became clear to Albert first, and then clear to me, that he really wasn't going to clean up the principality the way he promised to his subjects and to all of the intelligence services that I'd pitched on the fact that he was going to clean up the principality. So he let everybody down. He gave at his speech when he in July of 2005, when he officially was his investiture. He announced a new ethic in Monaco where he was going to clean everything up. Of course, it alarmed everybody who was doing dirty stuff in Monaco, including most of his ministers and others.
When you say dirty stuff, what do you mean by that? Like, do you think
Corruption,
people corruption,
corruption, and money
just
laundering.
taking money,
Yeah, corruption
taking
and
it?
money laundering. That's what he wanted to clean up, or at least so he said. I think he meant it at the time, but he let down his subjects. He let down
What type? When you say corruption, what type of corruption? Like, what
oh
were they doing? Like stealing tax money, or like
no,
running
well,
schemes or NGOs? Or what?
no. But for example, I'm going to use the example of his own palace accountant, who a couple of years, well, let me go back. His own palace accountant was engaged in real estate corruption by aligning himself with real estate interests who were bidding on major projects in Monaco, secretly working for them while influencing the prince about where to go and who to give the bid to, in exchange for a secret stake, lots of money. That's a good example right there. It took, in fact, we investigated the guy, and we investigated Albert's personal lawyer and pointed out to Prince Albert that they were both terribly corrupt. Albert didn't want to know. He didn't believe it. What happens? Just a couple years ago, it all caught up with him, and the palace accountant, whose name was Claude Palmero, was evicted from the palace, escorted to his car by the Carabinieri, and has been at war with the palace ever since. There's a big fight going on in Monaco between the palace and the ex-palace accountant, who Albert knew was corrupt 20 years ago, but didn't do anything about it then. Only finally did something a few years ago when the French media exposed his corruption.
Got it. For people who don't know, Monaco's right there on the border between France and Italy, so it's literally like in between them both. Very tiny principality.
Yeah.
So after you left, you kind of have, writing other books. You're in Montecito, you're in California, and then you started a Substack. And what made you interested in covering New Mexico and Bill Richardson's connection to Zorro?
Well, like so many journalists, I've been following the Epstein case, and now the Epstein files with great interest. And it was surprising to me to discover that although they had searched Epstein's various properties, that they never really did a search of Zorro Ranch, which was his mansion-like property in New Mexico. And I suspect the reason for that was the influence of Bill Richardson, who was a two-term governor of New Mexico, in addition to having cabinet jobs in the administration of Bill Clinton. I believe he was the energy secretary. And Richardson got implicated in the Epstein stuff by Mayor of Virginia Giuffre, who accused Andrew of having sex with her when she was only 17 years old. Andrew denied it, and now those denials are now all proving to be false. She also said that when she was in New Mexico, she had sex at the age of 17 with Bill Richardson. He denied it. He's no longer alive. He passed away a couple of years ago. But there is no reason to disbelieve Virginia Giuffre at this point because we now know she was telling the truth about Andrew. Why would she make something up about Bill Richardson? So to me, that's the interesting connection about why nothing ever got done about his ranch, searching it, even though in 2019, according to an email in the Epstein files, somebody informed the FBI that the bodies of two foreign females are buried somewhere on the grounds of Zorro Ranch. So the question is, what happened? Did the FBI not think to send cadaver dogs, not search, not look around for dead bodies? Um, Apparently, nothing happened at all. Why did nothing happen? These are good questions. Only now that this has come out, that particular email from the Epstein files has the New Mexico legislators, just last week decided to open an investigation into Zorro Ranch. Why did the FBI sit on it all this time? It's there's more to come out, much more to come out, in my opinion.
I think so too. There's a lot of dark evidence of Epstein traffic. I mean, at least in the files of him going to Mexico to abuse kids, and New Mexico is fairly close to the Mexican border, and him being in Juarez in 2014, which is a huge tell. That's another one of these files, and there's no reason to go to Juarez. You know, on his list of options, if he can go to Paris and New York and Miami and the Caribbean, there's only one reason to go to Juarez. And what's it notorious for? Trafficking.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'll tell you something I found interesting. I was in New Mexico coming up 3 years ago. I was in Santa Fe and I was staying at the Anasazi Hotel. Went to the bar there. Bill Richardson was still alive then. It was a few months before he passed. By the way, he was a very young man when he passed, and they never said why. They just say of natural, died in his sleep at his summer home in Chatham, Massachusetts, but never said how or why. Well, when I was there and I was in the Anasazi bar, probably the most upmarket bar in Santa Fe, and struck up a conversation with a bartender who told me that Bill Richardson would come in all the time. But the problem with that was he drank too much. He was very bitter, drank too much, and was extremely argumentative. And I didn't put that together with Epstein back then, even though he'd already been accused by Virginia Giuffre. But clearly, he didn't end his last few years were not very happy. I think he had a sense of what was coming down the pike and how whatever legacy he might have was going to be in tatters. That's what I wrote about on my Substack post.
Yeah, and it still is. Here he is with Bill Clinton, which you never want to be in a picture.
Yeah, that's right.
And there's Giuffre in Santa Fe. I haven't seen this picture, but
it's new. It came out of the recently released Epstein files.
Okay, I wasn't aware of that. Wow. So it's just incredible. Have you heard what the guy who was the former head, he managed the Grateful Dead, the father of Courtney Love, said about Zorro Ranch? You ever heard that?
No, I've not.
Really dark stuff was going on there. Let me see if I can find it.
Yeah, well, especially if you've got this suggestion that two bodies are buried there, maybe there's more than just two. And once again, what are they going to find? Now they say they're investigating, but who's in charge of the investigation? You really can't trust the investigators anymore.
Yeah, you can't. Can you trust the state investigators? I mean, in New Mexico, like I don't know.
Really depends on how influential Bill Richardson continues to be with those aligned with him, or maybe were involved. After all, it was in New Mexico. Who else from New Mexico politics or business was at Zorro Ranch? They had to have every reason to want to kill an investigation into the place.
Right.
Maybe that's where the real Eyes Wide Shut room is in Zorro Ranch. I think Stanley Kubrick was onto something when he made that movie in 1999.
He really was. I mean, the other thing about Zorro is there was like a cop who lived around there and said that there was a barn there that had he thought there was an incinerator. Have you heard that one?
I have not, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, let me see. Let me see if I can bring this one up. This is incredible. Like, I mean, I'm trying to find this other one, but I'll share the. You can find this. I don't know if you've like looked through the files, but you can find this one at EFTA 012499623. Basically, he says, I live in the neighborhood of a property owned by Jeffrey Epstein. Property, which is on Zorro Ranch Road, Staley, New Mexico, has recently had a large barn constructed. The barn is suspicious as there's a garage door that appears to be a sally port. There's a chimney. Blank is concerned that the property could potentially have an incinerator concealed behind the barn. So, is there rumors the property was used for recruiting girls to visit with Epstein, but he has no factual evidence to support this claim. Blank heard that rumors that girls from Albuquerque and the Moriarty area were recruited for Epstein. Blank patrolled this area for 15 years before he retired. So this is somebody who's kind of familiar with that area.
Wow, I mean that bodes badly, and Epstein would have had total protection from the governor, from Bill Richardson,
because he's blackmailed, right? So we know Giuffre said that somebody was sent there, but who else was sent to Bill Richardson, right? Like maybe there are other things going on.
There's all, the talk continues as to who he may have really been working for or providing evidence. He's probably been providing stuff to a number of intelligence entities, because for himself, it was all about leverage and new influence. And
maybe you can expand on that, because he seemed to have connections with the CIA, the Mossad, through Robert Maxwell, all kinds of stuff. Like he seems to have kept going with the Maxwell kind of operation. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and because of the Maxwell connection, I think Mossad in Israel is the most obvious of who, if he did have intelligence connections, who he would be ultimately working for, and creating honeypot traps for compromise, to be able to leverage as needed by whichever intelligence service, perhaps Mossad, for light leverage. Yes, it's blackmail for sure, but it's common in the intelligence services, and it sure seems like Epstein had everything wired up and was recording everything that was going on there, and we've yet to see a bunch of that stuff. Hopefully, we will get a chance to down the road, but yes, I think it's completely plausible that he was serving an intelligence service, and maybe more than one.
Right, which wouldn't be the first. So he's like a triple spy or triple agent or something. They talk about double agents, but like showing somebody something or FBI, and that's how he gets away with it, right?
So I think he was working everyone. He was working everyone he possibly could.
Which is smart. That's how you keep from getting arrested, just like Whitey Bulger, right?
It was good for a while, but Epstein didn't have a happy ending.
So your thought is he was killed in jail? Do you believe that?
I don't believe in the suicide. No, I believe he was murdered. Yeah, it's just too weird, too crazy. All the cameras get turned off. The guards go to sleep. Now somebody in inmate clothing, an orange robe, is going up the stairway. I believe, and then the family, the pathologist representing the Epstein family, who was there for the autopsy, said that the marks on his neck could not be there from hanging, but only from strangulation through somebody's hands. Yeah. So I believe he was murdered.
Yeah, I think you're right. This statement by Hank Harrison, Courtney Love's dad, was done a long time ago. This is like 10 years ago on a different forum somewhere on Facebook. But he writes, since my daughter was in Epstein's Black Book in 2003, and since she bragged to me about how she was procuring victims for him, I think I have a right to speak with some authority here. The crimes are 10 times worse and 100 times more numerous and more degenerate than you can imagine. The New Mexico Zorro Ranch is bad, but when victims were worn out, they would simply be taken to the desert and buried, or taken to sea, weighted down, and dumped overboard. The ones who survived are lucky to be alive. We are talking multiple slave murders here. Clinton did not procure slaves. Trump did. Google me before you reject this comment. Pretty intense.
That is very intense. Yes.
So there's multiple different stories that coming out about that place, which is very isolated, like it's apparently in the middle of nowhere. Like that's my understanding.
Yeah.
Yeah. So people check out his Substack. It's your last name, right? It's just
So no, it's roberteringer.substack.com.
Robert Eringer.
I post something every day. Lately I've been focusing on Monaco because of this book coming out. I'd actually moved on in my life from it, but finally decided the truth needed to be told, and that's why this book's appearing, and that's why I'm writing more often about it on Substack. But I write on a whole lot of issues, and I write a weekly news review, which I spell Revue, because I kind of poke fun at what's going on in the news. And it is also published simultaneously by Santa Barbara Current.
Santa Barbara Current. So there it is right there. Saw you were on Caravan to Midnight.
That is today's news review. Yes.
Gotcha. So news review, bunch of different articles there. When is your book being published?
March 19th, and it's now available on pre-order from Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other internet booksellers.
And you have your other books there as well, too. So you've got Ruse there.
Ruse, yeah, they should be
novels.
There. Yep.
It's written The Spy Master and Me. I mean, you have a pretty good, or it looks like you've written about 10 books or something like that.
Yeah, I write novels as well. And my latest thing's been, went through a phase where I like to write road novels where I take a real road trip and marry it with a fictional plot and characters. I did that with a book called Motional Blur that was published by Skyhorse in 2016.
I have a lot of authors from Skyhorse, so it's a good outfit. Is there anything you'd like to add? I mean, we're at the 45-minute mark. Do you want to take some comments or check the comments? Here's I don't know if you were following, but there's a lot of people talking. Great interview. Says Southwest. Thank you. Thank you, Robert. Says Jack.
I saw the comment there. It said, why keep him alive? Meaning, how did I escape all that? The simple answer is, if I'd stayed in Monaco any longer, I believe that my life was at risk because I had the palace accountant gunning for me. He actually tried to end the intelligence service without Prince Albert's authority, but he pretended that he had Prince Albert's authority to terminate my intelligence service, even though he had no idea what the extent of it was or all the relationships we had with other intelligence services. I had him seriously sore at me and then the Prince Albert's personal lawyer, Thierry Lacoste, who was in cahoots with the accountant in their real estate corruption. And then I became better known for the first few years as intelligence advisor. And even when I started the Monaco Intelligence Service, I was very invisible. But once we had Albert had the good chief of staff who was actually trying to implement a cleanup program, word began to get around that Albert had his own intelligence apparatus. And a lot of people were upset about that. They didn't like the idea that Albert could have information that didn't come from Monaco's interior ministry. Up until then, the police couldn't even get their information through to the palace. It was all filtered by the interior ministry and controlled. So nobody wanted Albert to have an intelligence service. Nobody wanted to be cleaned up. And I'm the guy who suddenly they realized was running it. And it was at that point where I decided not only wasn't I going to put up with this any longer, because clearly Albert was not going to clean things up like he said he would, but I think my life was at risk as well. As an official from MI6 told me, you better at least close down your safe house here, that little apartment where we'd have all of our meetings and where I slept when I was at Monaco. He said, because you're going to get firebombed. At the time when the accountant actually tried to terminate our intelligence service, I realized the word was out. I did feel threatened, and I understood that if I stayed longer, that I might not exist beyond that for very long.
Gotcha. South Tower says, great interview. Sammy says, thank you. Jack asked you, why did Ira Einhorn mummify the girl? Why was that his choice? Do you know?
I guess he didn't know how to get rid of the body. Ira Einhorn is very lazy, so the idea of taking a body down from an apartment into a car and putting it in a trunk, I didn't think he had a car. He would have had to involve somebody else who would then be a witness against him, maybe possibly turn him in. I mean, I'm only thinking on his behalf, but he probably thought it was the safest place to keep her and not be discovered that he'd murdered her. Why it took the Philadelphia police 2 years to get a warrant to go into his house when everybody, her family, knew that she was the last person he saw. Once again, a lot of it is incompetence and bungling. It's not just when the FBI doesn't do stuff when they should have done it, it's because they're hiding something. It's because of sheer incompetence and bungling things like that seem to have just happened in Tucson, Arizona, with this abduction.
Right. Kent says, great interview. Thanks, Kent. Silent wants to ask me about Bill Colby, and D.B. Cooper. That seems like a stretch. You ever heard that theory?
I've never heard that theory.
Okay.
I never have.
Very interesting. Good thing you got out. Jack says, great interview. So we had 160 live listeners. So thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for the comments. And is there anything else you'd like to add, Robert, before we wrap it up?
I mean, I could go on for another 2 hours, but I think we covered
I'll have
enough.
you back after you publish the book. Then I can read it and I can ask you some pertinent questions.
Great. I'd love to join you again and your listeners.
Great. So you have a Substack. Do you have a website yet, or it's just your Substack?
No, well, I did at one point, but I merged it with Substack. So roberteringer.com goes to the Substack.
Gotcha. So it's Robert Eringer, ERINGER.substack.com.
Yes.
I'll put him. That's it. Silent says thank you. William says have him back for sure. Yeah, you can definitely.
I'll come back anytime you like.
And Truth Seeker says I like this guy a lot. John Vieira says it was a pleasure. Learned a ton. So thanks for coming on. Really appreciate it. Again, the guest is Robert Eringer, ERINGER. And then he has a book coming out, which I showed the cover of it. So keep an eye out, guys. It's Spy Master of Monte Carlo, Tales of Royalty, Espionage, and Betrayal. So, Robert, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, William. Appreciate you having me on.
Okay, great. Stay there.